So, afternoon, Andy. How's it going?
I'm great, thank you, Jude. Good to see you.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to speak to me today about my humble little project, which on the surface seems about fixing my batteries for my wireless headphones, but is in fact a vehicle to have a wider discussion about the right to repair and what designers can consider when designing new products involving lithium polymer batteries or indeed any other form of that technology. I thought you'd be a perfect person to speak to, very kindly introduced by a mutual friend, Don Robson, who I worked together on the Radio Globe. But I wondered, without stealing too much of your thunder, if you could give a little bit of a quick CV of your background and how you got to be quite expert in this field of battery technology.
Sure. So I currently work at Nordic Semiconductor on power management software. I've been here about a year. Before that, I worked at Dyson for 6 years, responsible for the software for all of the lithium-ion battery packs that went into all the products. So focusing on high safety, high volume, that sort of area.
Yes, and so that sort of is again, you sort of nicely teed up a really important point of safety, and maybe that's a good point to jump into it, in that fundamentally when taking apart my headphones, which I have here, once you basically open these up, you find yourself with one of these little lithium polymer batteries. And for anyone who wasn't familiar with this, you actually were very kind in guiding me through the fact that this doesn't just have a red cable and a black cable, but also the white one is related to a thermistor. And so I wondered, could you just sort of educate people a little bit on what the purpose of that is, and indeed, how did it evolve as part of the technology offering?
Yeah, so those batteries have a PCB on it. So if you look at the top end, there's the capped on tape at the top, and a PCB is a protection circuit. So particularly for the home user, if you're working on something that's got one of these, you know that there's some good protection there against overcharge and damage. There's still a big risk of if you pierce it or you crush it, it can be very unsafe, but it's got a certain level of protection. Often in the news, people talk about the dangers of the cells they sell for vaping. Now, those are bare cells, so if they can catch fire or explode if you short them, whereas those have some measure of protection. It's not infallible, but there is some level of protection there against overcharge, for example.
And am I right in thinking that the white wire is basically related to a temperature sensor or thermistor, as it will be known?
Yes, so that's got a thermistor which can check that it's so charging and discharging have to be within a particular safe operating area as specified by the user. So normally you can only charge between, say, 0 and 40 or 0 and 50 degrees, depending on the cell. Charging outside that can damage the cell and lead it to be unsafe.
Yes, absolutely. And so I found that actually it's quite simple to check the characteristics of this after you had told me that you can just get a multimeter and check the resistance between the ground wire and the sense, the white wire. And it turns out that most of the batteries that I tried from third party were around the 10K resistance region, although you said there is a factor of 10 up that is sometimes used in rare occasions.
So yeah, so there's normally they are 10K. So when we say a 10K thermistor, we mean that its characteristic is 10 kiloohms at 25 degrees, and then it changes with temperature. You can get 100K, but almost all of them will be 10K because then that's the standard, and it means that everyone can use common hardware.
Yes, and indeed, as the temperature changes, the resistance decreases or increases. So from that point.
So you get higher resistance at lower temperature. So very cold, very cold temperature, it goes open circuiting, gets about a K at, I can't remember the exact number, but it's 78 degrees, it'll be down to about a K, I think.
That sounds about right. So yeah, I guess one of the things that also we should get up to that you've actually been kind enough to follow me through this entire journey of trying to sort of troubleshoot. And one of the things that had sort of bugged me about this is I wondered, was there some sort of clever I don't want to use the words shenanigans or sort of imply that it's a sort of planned obsolescence, but I was wondering, was there some sort of clever chipping that meant when I put a third-party battery into my old headset, it just didn't seem to accept it and behave normally? And I think your opinion was that sounds unlikely. I was wondering, could you expand on that?
Certainly, I think it's pretty unlikely, particularly for those batteries. They've normally got a very small set of protections. The most important protections, so under voltage, over voltage,
Yep.
and over current, which are the three key ones that can lead to an unsafe condition. It's really unlikely that people would be able to, within the confines of sort of the development cycle for industrial use, where you're really interested in keeping the bill of materials down, you wanted to do things cheaply, you're not going to want to try and guess if someone's changed the battery. There are some applications where they use that, things like laptop batteries, but that's normally done by a specific piece of hardware. So your laptop will communicate over a bus to a chip on the battery pack for your laptop, which will maybe have some authentication. But for things like that LiPo one you've got there, that won't be the case. I can't remember if you dismantled that one and found the part number, but they're normally sort of between 4 and 8 pins, very, very simple, very low cost, just to get that level of protection, really.
Yeah, and so there's absolutely no evidence of that at all. And I think just for the sake of being faithful here for the viewer, that I have actually subsequently found out that the fault was probably on the hardware of the headphones. As actually I bought a second-hand one which was in mint condition, and essentially verified the fact that actually it was probably the fault of that, as the third-party batteries worked with that, and conversely, when trying the old battery, it did still connect up and perform. So as it were, we got to the bottom of it, but obviously it isn't every day that I find myself lucky enough to get a secondhand set of headphones that are identical for a very cheap price, as usually they're in the 200-300 range. But I wondered if you wouldn't mind, as it were, giving a little bit of background into some of the sort of the science behind the batteries. As for example, I got this internal resistance tester on your recommendation, which although demonstrated that most of the third-party batteries were ultimately very similar, I was wondering, could you explain a little bit what the difference between just getting out your multimeter is and plugging in a specialist internal resistance meter does?
Yeah, well, so particularly for measuring the internal resistance, we're looking at, was that one 50 milliohms?
So it was all around. In fact, I can probably share it if I just get my act together. And here we go. So here's actually some of the data, and me being, hopefully, tell me if you can see it.
Yep, disappeared now.
Yeah. So basically I had a look at the thermal resistance, the thermistor resistance, and as you can see, it's pretty much all the same. That's the original, that's the newish one. These are the third parties. I accidentally tested the internal resistance essentially upstream with the PCB, and you advised me to do it down at the cell level. And so I did that. And although there's a bit of fluctuation, generally speaking, it's obviously not much difference. So we're talking 0.04 to 0.06 ohms there for the internal resistance.
Yeah, so that's around 50 milliohms, which is pretty typical for those sort. It's a bit hard without knowing the pack what's normal. So for things like 8650, which is the large cylindricals, it can be a lot lower than that. You could be at 10 or 15 milliohms, obviously for higher power. This is something you can't measure with a normal meter. So a normal meter wouldn't be able to record this. So it can only be done with a specialist meter that you found. Even a fancy lab 6-digit job won't do this. So it needs to be a special piece of equipment to do this.
Yeah, and it's somewhat characterized by a notice that it actually has two cables coming out of it for the positive and 2 cables coming out of it negative. So I'm guessing it does some comparative work somehow.
Yeah, so it's 4 wires, so it corrects for the loss on the cables, because obviously a few milliohms here and there is
significant.
Yeah, and you will get that from the cables.
Yes. And so, yeah, I thought that was particularly interesting. And I guess while I've got the screen share open, tell me if you can just see the legislation tab that I've just opened up.
I can, yes.
We're not going to get into it in high detail, but I just thought I would show this for the viewers, the directive 2006-66 EC, which is sort of, as far as I understand, pending. And I'm not going to profess to be a legal expert on this, but I think it's fair to say the gist is saying it's trying to challenge designers and manufacturers of portable devices, such as headphones, iPads, whatever it is, to basically say you need to think about the end of life of this and whether it could be user serviceable. And one of the provocations is a competent person, i.e., in other words, a repair shop or an engineer, should be able to conceivably change this out. It's maybe worth pointing out it does not say anyone from the general public off the street should be able to do it. And I'm wondering, you probably have a little bit more insight going back to safety here of why that, I don't want to call it a loophole, but why that discrepancy is important.
Yeah, I mean, I think being user serviceable, obviously, if you've got something like a vacuum cleaner, which I know you've worked on, you get a physical battery pack and the whole thing comes apart and can be replaced. I know it's much more of an issue of things like headphone. Well, the headphones you had as an example are quite user serviceable. Maybe with earpods or whatever, it's a bit more
Yes,
challenging.
the tiny little ones I think are practically impossible, right?
Yeah, but I guess you can do phones, and there's always a trade-off between people want it smaller, they want it waterproof. I'm not actually sure of what whether phone providers provide batteries these days or not, or whether they all have to be sourced from third parties.
Yes, and again, I'm reticent to know exactly how this plays out, as the legislation is pretty hefty, but it appears that if you go over, I think it's like a ton of batteries a year that you are putting out into the world, you have to provide some mechanism to essentially take them back and make sure that they don't just end up in landfill. So I think, for some small startups, that means that they're not really going to have a hard time with it. But if it's a sort of serious multinational, this is, a ton isn't actually that much, So I think it feels like they're trying to be measured in that if you're a small little startup, you kind of can get away with it for a bit longer and it won't kill you just yet. But the importance of this issue clearly should be growing in designers' minds as to not necessarily how to work around the legislation, but almost how to embrace it and make better user serviceable products. I guess on that note, we talked a little bit just before we were recording about Fairphone and some of their sort of ideology and product development. I'm wondering, are there any reflections from your side of whether that's the future, or is it, coming at a price? What's your thoughts?
I really like the user serviceable as a benefit. I forgot the name of the company now. Framework as well is another good example, I think, of laptops which allow you to replace all the parts individually. I think maybe the phones I think are particularly difficult though, just because of the way that all the other the price and the performance is very difficult. I think it's a great idea, but it's quite challenging. I think it's more challenging than the laptops. I think things like a laptop, people would be more prepared to accept a couple of millimeters of thickness and the cost. I think as a concept, it's very good, especially now the need to upgrade has gone. People are using phones for a lot longer. If you end up throwing your phone away because the batteries run out, it's a real shame when the performance is acceptable. I don't think that there's not the variation in performance that you need, especially for the average user doesn't need the very latest and greatest. If they can replace the battery every couple of years, I think you could easily keep a phone for 5 or more years these days.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have an iPhone SE, and honestly, there's no cracks on the screen. It's it's about 6 or 7 years old, and really, without sounding too conspiracy theorist, the only thing that's really killing it is the software updates.
Yeah.
It's absolutely fine. Other than that, the battery hasn't pillowed out or any of that nonsense. So, so I think what I'm getting at is not to sort of give Apple a good kicking, but more say that I think the provocation here for a lot of companies is how do you adjust the business model when you've been used to selling people a new product every year? And if you're encouraging them to sort of change out the batteries and possibly have that thing in play for 10 years, maybe, I guess I'm almost reminded strangely of non-electric cars, which a friend of mine who will remain nameless said that about 50% of the revenue generated from a car is 50% on the sales and 50% on parts and maintenance.
Yeah.
And so actually that's one of the things that's difficult about electric cars is it's disrupted the business model. It's not that companies don't want to go green per se, it's that they haven't figured out how to get the cash back on it. And I wonder, do you think at the heart of it, that is the problem of a lot of consumer devices is it's either going to become very serviceable and premium, or it's going to become disposable, like vapes.
Yeah, and this is a challenge for the business model. Obviously, the business wants to sell more stuff, and if your stuff's so good that you never need to sell another one, it's a challenge to keep going. I think the car analogy is good there because you'd be going to the dealership for your tires and your oil and things, and if that's going away, they want to get you in there to look at buy a new car as well. So it's all
Yeah.
part of their service. It's difficult.
So yeah, no, I mean, and again, I think if there was an easy answer, it would have surprised me to this. So I think it's more just a sort of general sort of provocation and just raising awareness. I think this project's been about. I do wonder though, when you're looking at sort of maybe if we step back from the battery, what are your thoughts just in general about the right to repair movement? That let's put the polymer batteries aside. Do you think that certainly coming from Dyson, I know we can't speak in too much granularity, but it's pretty well known that Dyson isn't held together with a lot of glue. They have a lot of screws. It's always been a little bit, should we say, a product of the fact so much testing is done that I know myself, I've taken apart the same vacuum cleaner possibly a couple hundred times in its development. And so ironically, it's sort of quite serviceable, almost by its genesis. And I wondered, what are your thoughts on that ideology becoming more prevalent?
I think for things that can be, if you can remove it with a screwdriver, I think some of those some of that legislation that you showed does apply to that. So things like for a larger product, the battery pack, which is expected to be replaced within the life of the product, has to be removable without specialist tools. So that's a specific design. And I remember one of the later things I worked on at Dyson was the packs from removable packs without tools, so you could just flick it and swap it over, and that's quite popular. I think there's an expectation of that when it comes to power tools or particularly garden tools. There's an expectation that you swap the batteries around and you buy a tool and you keep the tool for a long time now. You don't just throw it away when it's expired. If you've got power tools which are at least 10 years old and they still work, whereas some of the consumer goods don't really last as long as that. Particularly phones and headphones don't seem to last quite the same time. But I think it should be possible to fix that. There's no reason why you can't, as you said, have a phone for 5 years. You don't have to have it every year and a half. Unless
Absolutely.
you're broken it again.
And so I wondered also one of the other facets of the legislation, and I appreciate we neither of us are legal experts on this, but putting aside the line by line detail, how do you think the legislation will be shaped by essentially this fine balance between consumers wanting it, but also technologists, research labs also provide incredible alternatives? Because, for example, if you said, well, let's not use lithium batteries because the chemicals are problematic, let's use supercapacitors. In fact, they come with their own set of problems. So it's not quite as simple as just a switch out or that looks shinier, let's use that instead. So I wondered, what do you think the relationship between consumer, industry, and legislators or government looks like from your perspective?
I think some of it does need to be fixed with legislation. Things like the common charger has been, I think, is going to be really successful. I mean, I recall every phone had its own charger, and you had drawers full
Madness.
of them. And the change of that to, we've got a dozen things in the house, and if everything's on USB-C, it makes it so easy. And
Yeah.
forcing people to do that, I think, is the right choice, even if they complain. And yeah, and I think the best way to reduce the sort of environmental footprint of these things is to use them longer. Because if you use something for twice as long, that's more important, I think, than some of these other issues. So maybe in legislation requiring things to work for a certain amount of time and be user replaceable or user serviceable, or maybe in some cases expert serviceable. Maybe the manufacturers have to supply parts for a certain number of years to, or repair service it, or whatever they're going to do.
Yeah, and I think it'll be interesting also to see whether even the data analysis for companies on legislation and dare I say taxation or penalties. I mean, it's an interesting consideration to say if I bought a phone and it cost so many tons of CO2, but I said, but hang on a minute, I can replace the battery 3 times before probably the general architecture of it just gives up. Then in some ways, does that mean you should be dividing it by a third? But of course, the problem with that is that's a theoretical notion that assumes the consumer will keep something for maybe 15 years when, dare I say it, I don't think marketeers are losing too much sleep by thinking we've suddenly stopped becoming a keeping up with the Joneses consumerist society, or at least I'll speak for the West. So I guess where I'm going with that is do you think that designers also need to inspire a different paradigm of our relationship with products? What are your thoughts on that? Is that just me being naive and old-fashioned, so that we should all make things out of wood and leather, or is there a different way to sort of enjoy the patina of age of our products?
I mean, I think personally speaking, I've been put off certain manufacturers when my daughter's laptop broke because the hinge fell off after 2.5 years, and some of that drives you away from manufacturers. I'm not sure if enough. Maybe if enough of it happens to enough people, they'll push to different suppliers, but it's hard to say. I know some companies, maybe if you push to, sorry, mine's gone blank. I think, maybe designers should take it upon themselves maybe to push for some of these things. As you said, like Fairphone or Framework, to why don't we make something better? Not everything has to be the same, it has to be disposable. It should be possible to have something and keep it for a long time.
Yeah, and do you mind if I sort of guinea pig with a little bit of a hypothesis on this, or at least I wouldn't call it a prediction, but I feel it's something that I was wanting to put in my blog. Is that there's a couple of websites which are basically starting to emerge where, to give a little bit of perspective, you're familiar with saying Amazon review will have, say, 4 stars out of 5. But when you actually look at it, a lot of those reviews are from people who've just taken it out of the box, switched it on, and maybe used it once or twice, and have deemed the product terrific. And there's a counterpoint to this, which someone who I found through Reddit basically was sort of creating a website that was the opposite. It was saying, when did this product die and how did it die? And so, for example, I did find my headphones on there, and actually very similar faults to mine occurred. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, in an ideal world, I would love it if there was a out of the box rating and then a X years later rating, and consumers were saying, well, it costs 10% more, but it seems to last twice as long as some of the competitors. And so I wonder, do you think it will also be a little bit driven by users starting to log their experience of living with these devices? Or is that, should we say, a little bit on the idealistic side?
I very much support that. A few things I bought recently which die at 2 years in 1 week, and if you knew that earlier, you would have bought something different. But I guess if someone could have that as how long things last would be a very interesting. Because I'm sure you've got some things you've bought and you'd sing from the rooftops about how great this thing is. It's lasted so long.
Absolutely. And I was just also realizing I completely blanked the name of the company. So it's Loria, LOORIA.com. And that I thought was a really interesting sort of thing. And I'll just quickly share the screen just of the blog work in progress, probably all sorts of typos. But you can see here that I actually found it from Reddit, obviously the greatest website. and basically you can see that the Sennheiser problems, how it broke, how many years it took, and sort of what the diagnosis was, but also people being positive about would they buy it again or would they not buy it again. And I think even though this really does feel a sort of a drop in the ocean compared to the juggernauts of consumerism that are out there on these big sort of platforms, I do think it's an interesting notion that people might make a purchasing decision if somehow this data was aggregated for them, that they said, yep, people love this, but they hate it a year later. Whereas these other people might say, oh, it's a bit expensive, but it does really last the test of time and takes the abuse. So I'm just wondering, do you think that that's going to be a shift that's, sort of from the ground up, or do you think it's going to come from top down, companies implementing those sorts of things?
I don't know. I think that I'd love to see that take off. How that can cope with the sort of astroturfing of the people selling stuff would be interesting to see. I think you're right. A lot of the reviews are, looked good in the box, 5 stars, and whether it actually works for 3 or 4 years is different. Or encouraging people to, maybe it's something people could do. You obviously, when you buy something, you get an invitation to review it a week later. Maybe an invitation to review it 2 years later would be better.
Yeah.
And it's something that some suppliers might like. If you've got, some of the maybe bricks and mortar stores with really good returns policies, they probably get bitten by some of these things. If you've got John Lewis or something, which is selling stuff with very good warranties, when it's all coming back after 2 years, they might be minded to get better information about what's reliable earlier rather than later.
Well, exactly. And I think that's always one of the things that, again, neither of us are here to plug Dyson, but it's well known for the 5-year guarantee on its products in the early days. And I don't know where that state of play is at the minute, but certainly, that is obviously woven into the price. You're paying for that somewhere else down the line. So I think, dare I say, my prediction is probably that there will be brands that do get more premium. But of course, the expectation is that you not only can repair things and there's a reassurance around it, but dare I say, there's probably a bit of a sort of cultish or fetishized enjoyment of doing this. I mean, I wouldn't say Fairphone is a fetish, but it's definitely a cult. There's something quite exciting about the notion that you could upgrade it, even though we obviously need a critical mass of those things to pick up. But yeah, I just wondered whether you had any closing thoughts or tips for, designers when looking at battery or just power choices. Is there anything that you'd recommend as a closing thought?
I think looking at the work you've been doing on those little lipo ones, I think if you're not completely focused on size, like mass production of headphones or something, I think those little lipo ones are really good, because that does provide opportunity for people to repair things. The ones with the flying leads and the integrated safety are really good.
Great. Well, that's a really great point to end on. And indeed, if there's any other thoughts or things, I'll make sure I put them in the blog. So I hope people enjoy reading that as well. But honestly, Andy, thanks so much for taking part in this at the end of what I'm sure is a busy week. And I hope you have a great weekend.
You too, Jude. Thanks a lot.
Thanks again.
Bye-bye.